One way or another, something important is going to happen here this week, which is, it should happen more regularly than it does, but it has not in the 4 years that I've been here. And that is a bill that actually is the result of thoughtful, bipartisan, I think in some cases I even describe it as nonpartisan work that's been done first by the so-called Gang of Eight that I was pleased to be part of, then the Judiciary Committee itself, and now on the floor of the Senate. And Mr. Chairman, before I talk about immigration, I want to mention that we are still struggling out in Colorado this summer with these terrible wildfires. And we've appreciated the federal cooperation that we've gotten, but it is a reminder to me when I stand on this floor how important it is for us to get past this partisan gridlock that we have and into a position where we're actually making shared decisions that allow us, among other things, to do the investments that we need to do to make sure that our forests have the fire mitigation that will prevent them from catching and burning the way they are this summer in Colorado. And today we've got the opportunity to try to work together on immigration. This is a bill that there have been opponents that have come out and said this bill is going to cost us money, this bill is going to make the deficit worse. It's exactly the opposite. The Congressional Budget Office has said that if we pass this bill, we will see $1 trillion, nearly $1 trillion of deficit reduction over 20 years. This Congressional Budget Office tells us it will increase our gross domestic product by 5.4% over that same period of time. So this bill is a deficit reduction bill. And those people around here that talk about deficit reduction, and I'm one of them, finally have the chance to do it in a thoughtful and measured way, in a useful and constructive way, rather than through a series of mindless across-the-board cuts that we've seen as a consequence of the sequester. So even in Washington, D.C., $1 trillion is real money, Mr. President, and that's a reason that we ought to pass that bill, this bill. Another reason we ought to pass this bill is that it creates a visa system that's actually aligned to the economic needs of the United States of America. 40% of Fortune 500 companies have been founded by immigrants. Nearly 1 in 10 business owners in Colorado are immigrants, generate $1.2 billion for our state's economy. Agriculture is a $40 billion industry in Colorado, and tourism is Colorado's second largest industry. We have a growing high-tech sector in Colorado. 23.6% of STEM graduates from our state research universities are immigrants. We want them to earn those degrees if they're doing it in the United States and then stay here in the United States. Build businesses in this country. Invent our future with us in this country. Today, because we have a broken immigration system, we're saying to those graduates, go back to China and compete with us. Go back to India and compete with us. We have no use for your talents here in this country. This bill fixes that. This bill has very important border security measures and measures to prevent future illegal immigration. I want to thank the senator from Tennessee who's on the floor for his remarkable work to get us to this point with Senator Hoeven. The agreement on border security, which maintains a real and attainable pathway to citizenship, which was a bottom line for the group of 8 senators who were working on this bill, was the result of several senators who were willing and who were determined to find a way to get this done. So I thank Senator Corker, I thank Senator Hoeven, and I thank Senator McCain and the other Republican members of the group of 8 for getting us here. This is how the Senate should work, a process that leads to principled compromise. On the border security amendment, some opponents of fixing our broken immigration system continue to say that our bill doesn't do enough to secure the border. No reasonable person could look at this legislation and arrive at that conclusion. Nearly $50 billion in additional spending at the border, 700 miles of fencing at the border. We double the number of border agents on the southern border of the United States. We go from roughly 22,000 to 44,000. Those numbers are directionally right. We double it. Our resources that are devoted, federal resources devoted to securing our border, we spend more money on that than we do on all other law enforcement that the federal government undertakes. And now we're doubling it. Now, you might be critical because you'd say, well, you shouldn't spend that money. Although, as I mentioned earlier, this bill results in deficit reduction of almost $1 trillion over 20 years. I can see how somebody might stand up and be critical about that. I can't see how somebody could seriously maintain that this bill does not secure our border. We call for an array of new technologies and resources at our border sectors to ensure 100% surveillance and rapid interdiction of threats and potential illegal crossings. E-Verify is required to be used by every employer in the United States so we don't end up here the way we ended up here the last time. You know, with a broken system where small businesses either became the INS or were given fake documents and people came here where there were jobs, illegally, not legally. This internal enforcement mechanism will allow us to make sure that small businesses know who they're hiring and that we're turning away people that are not here and that are unlawful and shouldn't work here in the United States of America. You know, this is the greatest country in the world, but 40% of the people that are here that are undocumented are people that came lawfully to the United States, overstayed their visa, and it's the consequence of our having a system to check people on the way in, but never checks them on the way out, or whether they left at all. This bill fixes that problem with a complete entry-exit system, with improved biographic and biometric tracking of those who come into and leave our borders. It's about time for us to begin to apply 21st century technology to this broken immigration system that we have. So, Mr. President, there are many economic reasons why we should support this legislation, this bipartisan legislation. And we know it will help businesses. We know it will boost our economy. We know we're securing our borders. And by the way, if people don't believe me on this, I hope they'll listen to Senator John McCain and Senator Jeff Flake, who are the two Republican border senators from a border state, who took me and others down there to see what the border actually looked like, who support this legislation, who have to go home to Arizona and be able to defend this legislation by saying it secures the borders of the United States of America. They know what they're talking about. We also can't lose sight of what this bill means for people, for families who are suffering under the current system. Here's one story, and then I'll yield the floor, from a bright young woman in Boulder, Colorado, who I had the fortunate pleasure to meet, Ana Karina Casas Ibarra. I first met Ana at a bagel shop in Boulder that my staff and I stopped in for a bite to eat. She waited on us and recognized me. When my staff overheard her explaining the dynamics of the 112th Congress, they suggested that she apply for an internship in my office, and she was an awesome intern. We had the opportunity to learn more about her story. 14 years ago, her mother brought her and her two younger brothers to the United States to escape an abusive marriage. Her mom had consistently juggled 2 or 3 jobs to support them, and though Ana was a good student, an old Colorado law denied her in-state tuition. She had to work to pay for community college a few semesters at a time. Her brothers, who saw her opportunity denied, lost their motivation. One brother, who speaks better English than Spanish, was deported, and the other brother, who has an American citizen wife and a baby, is facing possible deportation right now. She just published her story in the Denver Post, and she wrote, quote, "Too many families share similar horror stories of separation. There are 11 million people who have entered this country illegally, and the time is now to provide them with a path to citizenship. It's time for immigration reform." I want to submit without objection Anna's op-ed for the record. Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to say again how proud I am of the work that Senator Corker and Senator Hoeven have done to get us to this point. I hope that we will come to agreement on some amendments between now and the end, or that we'll just take up this bill. But it's time for us to pass it. It's time for us to fix this problem for our economy and for the families all across this country. and I believe we can do it. And I think that the opportunity for this Senate to show that, after all, it can work in a bipartisan way that produces a meaningful piece of legislation is very important to the American people. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.